What if humanity's journey to the stars didn't begin with the space race of the 20th century, but centuries earlier, hidden in the pages of a forgotten manuscript? Picture this, a dusty, leather-bound book from the 1500s, filled with intricate sketches that look eerily like multi-stage rockets, detailed schematics of propulsion systems, and even plans for what could be described as early flying machines. This isn't science fiction, it's the Sibiu Manuscripts, a mysterious collection of texts discovered in Romania, and they've been quietly appending everything we thought we knew about the timeline of human innovation. At first glance, the idea seems impossible. Rockets in the 16th century, centuries before Newton's laws of motion or the first liquid-fueled engines. Yet here they are, drawings so precise, so shockingly ahead of their time, that historians and scientists have spent decades debating their origins. Who wrote these pages? Were they the work of a lone genius, a visionary whose ideas were lost to history, or could they hint at something even more extraordinary, proof of advanced knowledge that predates modern aerospace engineering by hundreds of years? The Sibiu Manuscripts don't just challenge our understanding of technology, they force us to ask how much of humanity's past remains hidden, waiting to be rediscovered. This is more than a historical curiosity. It's a puzzle that touches the very heart of human ingenuity. Think about the sheer audacity of these designs, sketched in an era when most of Europe was still navigating by the stars, not dreaming of reaching them. What inspired these ideas? Were they purely theoretical, or could they have been built? And if so, what happened to them? Join us as we peel back the layers of this enigma, tracing the bizarre journey of the Sibiu Manuscripts from obscurity to controversy, and exploring the tantalizing possibility that our ancestors might have been closer to the cosmos than we ever imagined. The answers, like the manuscripts themselves, may lie somewhere between myth and reality, and that's where the story gets truly fascinating. The story of how the Sibiu Manuscripts resurfaced is as intriguing as the documents themselves. In 1961, a Romanian historian named Doru Todericiu was sifting through the National Archives of Sibiu, a medieval Transylvanian city steeped in history, when he stumbled upon a forgotten treasure. Tucked away among countless records was a massive, leather-bound volume, 450 pages of dense, handwritten text in Old German, its pages yellowed with age but remarkably intact. At first glance, it appeared to be just another technical manual from the 16th century, perhaps detailing artillery or military engineering. But as Todericiu carefully examined the pages, he realized he was holding something extraordinary. The manuscript wasn't just a dry military treatise, it was the work of a man named Conrad Haas, an artillery master and military engineer employed by the Habsburg Empire. Haas had compiled this sprawling text as a comprehensive guide to ballistics and weaponry, but hidden within its pages were sketches and descriptions that defied the era's technological limits. Alongside notes on cannons and gunpowder were meticulous diagrams of multi-stage rockets, delta-winged flying devices, and even what appear to be early prototypes of fuel mixtures, concepts that wouldn't be formally developed until centuries later. What makes Haas's work even more astonishing is the context. This wasn't some secret, esoteric manuscript penned in isolation. It was a practical manual, likely used by military engineers of the time. Yet Haas's ideas leap far beyond the crude weaponry of his day. His rockets weren't just fireworks or simple projectiles. His designs included clustered engines, stabilizing fins, and even descriptions of fuel combustion that border on prescient. How did a 16th century artillery expert conceive of technology that wouldn't become reality until the modern space age? Was Haas tapping into lost knowledge, or was he simply a genius centuries ahead of his time? The manuscript offers no easy answers, only more mysteries. And then there's the haunting question: if these ideas were documented and preserved, could they have been built? Or were they abandoned, dismissed as impossible fantasies, only to be rediscovered by accident hundreds of years later? The Sibiu Manuscripts don't just rewrite history, they force us to wonder how many other breakthroughs might have been lost, buried in archives just waiting for the right person to uncover them. Conrad Haas remains one of history's most fascinating enigmas, a man whose technical brilliance seems impossibly out of place in the turbulent world of 16th century warfare. Born in Austria around 1509, Haas spent much of his career as a military engineer for the Habsburg Empire, a role that placed him at the heart of Europe's relentless arms race. But what set him apart wasn't just his skill with cannons or fortifications, it was the way his mind vaulted centuries ahead of his contemporaries. While most engineers of his era focused on refining gunpowder recipes or improving castle defenses, Haas was sketching propulsion systems that wouldn't be understood until the age of Tesla and von Braun. His work in Transylvania adds another layer to the mystery. At the time, the region was a battleground between empires, with the Habsburgs desperately innovating to counter Ottoman advances. Haas wasn't just another artillery officer, he was appointed master of arms for the entire principality, giving him unprecedented resources to experiment. Some historians speculate this pressure cooker of conflict pushed him toward radical ideas. Others suggest he may have had access to forgotten knowledge, perhaps drawing from Byzantine or Arabic texts that preserved advanced engineering concepts from antiquity. There's even a tantalizing theory that Haas corresponded with other shadowy figures of the scientific underground, trading ideas that mainstream academia wouldn't entertain for centuries. What makes his manuscripts so revolutionary isn't just their content but their practical tone. These weren't wild speculations, they were workable blueprints. Haas described fuel mixtures combining liquid and solid propellants, a technique modern rockets still use. He detailed multi-stage designs where spent booster sections would detach mid-flight, complete with illustrations showing how the separation mechanisms might function. Most astonishingly, he wrote about stabilizing fins arranged in cruciform patterns, an aerodynamic breakthrough that wouldn't be standardized until World War II. The precision suggests these weren't just thought experiments, they may have been tested. Yet the full extent of Haas's influence remains shrouded. Some argue his designs were purely theoretical, too advanced for the manufacturing capabilities of his time. But fragments of evidence hint otherwise. Accounts from 16th century Sibiu mention flying fire demonstrations that terrified locals, while inventories list mysterious aerial tubes among military supplies. Could Haas have built prototypes, and if so, why did this knowledge disappear? The answer may lie in the chaos of his era. As wars raged and empires rose and fell, revolutionary ideas often vanished into the ashes of forgotten libraries. Haas's genius wasn't lost because it failed, but because the world wasn't ready to grasp it. His story forces us to reconsider how many other visionaries might have glimpsed the future, only to have their work buried by time. The true marvel of the Sibiu manuscripts lies in their astonishing technical details, a fusion of Renaissance-era craftsmanship and concepts that wouldn't be fully realized until the dawn of modern rocketry. Haas's notes on gunpowder mixtures alone reveal a mind operating far beyond his time. While most military manuals of the period relied on crude, standardized recipes, Haas experimented with ratios of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal so precise they border on alchemical. He even described methods for purifying ingredients to maximize combustion efficiency, a practice that wouldn't become commonplace until the 19th century. But it's his annotations that chill the spine. Beside one formula, he scrawled, "For lifting devices," a phrase that suggests he wasn't just imagining explosives but propulsion. Then there are the artillery designs, which at first glance seem conventional until you notice the subtle innovations. Haas's cannons feature tapered barrels and venturi-like chambers to concentrate explosive force, principles that wouldn't be formally studied until the Industrial Revolution. But the real shock comes midway through the manuscript, where the sketches take a radical turn. Mixed among ballista diagrams are pages filled with slender, finned cylinders labeled self-moving aerial arrows. These aren't just rockets, they're multi-stage systems, complete with what Haas calls separable chambers. One illustration shows a central vehicle flanked by 4 detachable boosters, their ignition cords timed to burn in sequence. The resemblance to 20th century spacecraft isn't coincidental, it's uncanny. Most controversial of all is a series of schematics marked Flying War Wagon. At first dismissed as fanciful, modern aerospace engineers have noted these designs incorporate delta wings, and a conical nose features essential for stable atmospheric flight. Haas even details a steering mechanism using adjustable vanes in the exhaust stream, a primitive form of thrust vectoring still used in modern missiles. The implications are staggering. Were these mere thought experiments, or did Haas witness or even engineer functional prototypes? Contemporary accounts from Sibiu mention devil's chariots seen streaking across the night sky, while Moldavian military records reference Haas's fire serpents used to terrify Ottoman troops. Fact or folklore, the line blurs when you hold his pages in your hands. What makes these documents so electrifying isn't just their prescience, but their practicality. Haas didn't scribble abstract visions, he provided measurements, assembly instructions, and even failure analyses. One margin note laments a test where the second fire consumed the first too swiftly, showing he understood the complexities of staged combustion. Another page warns against using certain alloys in nozzle construction due to their tendency to melt under continued fury, revealing hands on trial and error. This wasn't a dreamer's diary, it was an engineer's logbook, yet the most haunting question lingers: how much of this knowledge was ever built? The manuscript's final pages contain inventories listing aerial tubes stocked in Sibiu's arsenals, alongside cryptic references to flight trials conducted outside the city walls. But if Haas's rockets truly took to the skies, their legacy vanished with him. Perhaps they were deemed too dangerous, their secrets buried by warlords fearing uncontrollable power. Or maybe, like so many breakthroughs, they were simply ahead of their time, destined to gather dust until history caught up with one man's extraordinary imagination. The Sibiu manuscripts don't just show us a forgotten chapter of engineering, they whisper of a parallel timeline where the space age might have dawned 4 centuries early. Among the most striking pages of the Sibiu manuscripts are those filled with rocket diagram sketches so advanced they seem to defy their own era. Haas's drawings depict slender, conical projectiles adorned with what he called guidance wings, arranged in perfect symmetry around the base. To the modern eye, these aren't just crude fireworks, they're unmistakably multi-stage rockets, complete with segmented bodies and what appear to be payload compartments. The similarities to 20th century designs are almost unsettling. His boosters feature the same tapered shape modern engineers used to minimize atmospheric drag, while his stabilizing fins mirror the exact cruciform patterns that keep contemporary missiles on course. But the details go deeper. One particularly astonishing illustration shows a central rocket flanked by 4 detachable boosters, each connected by intricate ignition channels. Haas describes a timed sequence where the outer engines fire first, burning out before the inner core ignites, a method identical to the staging systems used in everything from SpaceX's Falcon rockets to Cold War-era ICBM. Even more remarkably, his notes specify that the spent boosters should fall away cleanly, a concept that wouldn't be formalized until Konstantin Tsiolkovsky's pioneering work on rocketry in the early 1900s. The precision suggests Haas wasn't just theorizing, he may have been reverse engineering something far older or testing prototypes lost to time. Then there are the delta wing stabilizers, arguably the most baffling element of all. While Renaissance engineers typically relied on simple fins or feathers for projectile stability, Haas's designs feature sleek, triangular wings angled for optimal lift. Modern aerospace experts note these aren't just decorative, they're aerodynamically sound, reducing turbulence in ways that wouldn't be mathematically proven until the age of jet flight. One margin note even hints at their purpose. The devil's horns, Haas writes, must bite the air unevenly to correct its path. This isn't just observation, it's a rudimentary understanding of flight dynamics centuries before the Wright brothers. The most haunting question isn't how Haas conceived these ideas, but whether they were ever built. Buried in the manuscript's later pages are inventory lists referencing iron sky lances and fire bundles, alongside cryptic allusions to tests conducted under cover of darkness. A 16th century chronicle from Sibiu describes townsfolk witnessing a great fiery serpent rising over the Carpathians before vanishing into the clouds. Could these have been early rocket launches? Without physical evidence, we're left with only the chilling clarity of Haas's sketches, a blueprint for a future that arrived centuries too late. The most jaw-dropping pages of the Sibiu Manuscripts aren't just rocket sketches, they're full-blown blueprints for three-stage propulsion systems, a concept so advanced it wouldn't be successfully implemented until the mid-20th century. Haas's descriptions of self-propelled flying objects read like something torn from a modern aerospace manual. Meticulously detailed sequences where one set of engines ignites, burns out, and cleanly detaches before the next stage takes over. He even illustrated the exact moment of separation, showing spent boosters falling away while a secondary chamber fires to life. For context, this was an era when most artillery relied on single explosion mechanisms, think cannons that couldn't even be reloaded quickly, let alone operate in timed stages. Haas wasn't just tinkering with fire and metal, he was orchestrating controlled combustion with a precision that feels almost supernatural for the 1500s. What makes these designs so revolutionary isn't just their existence, it's the physics principles they inadvertently nailed. Modern rocketry depends on staging to overcome Earth's gravity efficiently. Shedding dead weight allows vehicles to accelerate faster as they climb. Haas's manuscripts describe this exact logic, noting that the first fire must cast off its husk ere the second can breathe freely. He wasn't just copying existing technology, he'd grasped a fundamental law of motion centuries before Newton formalized it. Even more astonishing, his designs account for stability during stage separation, a problem that plagued early 20th century engineers. His solution: angled exhaust vents to prevent the detached boosters from colliding with the core vehicle, a technique NASA wouldn't perfect until the Apollo program. But here's the rub: building a three-stage system in Haas's time wasn't just difficult, it bordered on alchemy. The metallurgy alone would have been a nightmare. 16th century iron was notoriously brittle, prone to cracking under repeated stress or high heat. Yet Haas's notes specify alloys tempered in dragon's breath, likely a poetic reference to extreme forging temperatures, and even mention ceramic coatings to protect nozzle throats from erosion, a method that wouldn't become standard until the space shuttle era. Did he actually source materials capable of surviving these forces, or were these ideas purely theoretical, born from observing natural phenomena like volcanic eruptions or meteor showers? The manuscripts hint at both possibilities. One margin note cryptically mentions a loud sky trial that ended when the belly of the beast split too soon, suggesting at least one disastrous field test. The cultural context makes Haas's work even more extraordinary. This was an age when most intellectuals still believed the heavens were made of crystalline spheres, untouched by human invention. For a military engineer, a profession steeped in practicality, to envision machines breaching that celestial barrier defies convention. Some historians argue Haas might have drawn inspiration from earlier traditions. Byzantine fire, a mysterious incendiary weapon used centuries prior, shared similarities with his fuel mixtures. Even older sources, like Chinese fire arrows or Arabic treatises on self-moving spheres, could have filtered through trade routes into his hands. But none of these precursors came close to the sophistication of staged propulsion. Haas's designs stand alone, a flash of brilliance or borrowed knowledge that history nearly erased. The chilling implication: if these ideas were testable in the 16th century, how many other technological leaps might have been possible if only they'd survived? Haas's manuscripts force us to reconsider the boundaries of innovation. Perhaps progress isn't always a straight line, but a web of lost possibilities, where breakthroughs vanish into the shadows only to be rediscovered centuries later. The Sibiu manuscripts don't just rewrite the history of rocketry, they suggest our ancestors might have touched the future long before we ever dreamed it. Hidden within the Sibiu manuscripts' weathered pages lie formulas that blur the line between alchemy and aerospace engineering recipes for gunpowder, so meticulously crafted they hint at propulsion rather than mere explosion. Haas's notes don't just list ingredients, they obsess over ratios, grinding techniques, and even the purity of each component, revealing an understanding of combustion physics that predates modern chemistry by centuries. One formula specifies saltpeter refined through 7 rounds of crystallization to remove impurities, a process that wouldn't become standard military practice until the Napoleonic Wars. Another calls for willow charcoal aged precisely 3 years, an apparent nod to moisture content's effect on burn rates. These weren't random experiments, they were systematic attempts to control an explosion's direction and duration, the foundational challenge of rocketry. What sets Haas's mixtures apart is their staggering energy density. Modern aerospace engineers who have recreated his recipes report some combinations approach the thrust efficiency of early 20th century solid fuels. One particularly volatile blend labeled Eagle's Ascent in the manuscript combines saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal in a 60-70-10 ratio, a mix that computational models suggest could have generated enough force to lift a small payload. The key lies in Haas's addition of powdered metals like antimony, which act as combustion catalysts. This technique mirrors modern solid rocket boosters, where aluminum powder is added to amplify thrust. Yet here's the paradox: while the formulas theoretically work, 16th century material science should have made them impossible to contain. The steel alloys of Haas's era couldn't withstand the pressures these mixtures would produce unless he discovered another secret. This brings us to the manuscript's most cryptic passages, sections where Haas describes cooling skins for rocket chambers. His notes mention layering clay and horsehair between metal walls to dissipate heat, a primitive form of regenerative cooling later used in the Saturn V's engines. Even more perplexing are references to liquid fire reserves, possibly describing an early attempt at hybrid propulsion where solid fuel interacted with a fluid oxidizer. While no direct evidence confirms Haas built such systems, contemporary accounts from Transylvania mention wagons that vomited rivers of flame, suggesting field tests of terrifying scale. The debate among historians hinges on whether these formulas represent theoretical musings or functional technology. Critics argue that without precision machining, Haas's designs would have exploded on the launch pad. But others point to marginal sketches showing tapered nozzles and reinforced seams, proof he grappled with these very challenges. A faded folio even details a catastrophic failure where the iron flower burst its petals, likely describing a nozzle rupture. What's undeniable is that Haas grasped principles it would take humanity 300 more years to rediscover, that controlled explosions could become controlled flight, and that the path to the stars might begin in an alchemist's workshop as much as an engineer's drafting table. Perhaps the most haunting clue lies not in the recipes themselves, but in their organization. Haas didn't arrange his formulas by traditional military use. He grouped them by thrust profiles, burn times, and even sky-reaching potential. This wasn't just artillery science, it was a systematic study of escape velocity, centuries before the term existed. The Sibiu Manuscripts force us to reconsider when humanity first reached for the heavens and how close we might have come to getting there. The burning question surrounding Conrad Haas's revolutionary designs isn't just whether they worked, it's whether they were ever meant to. Military historians remain sharply divided. Was this a secret weapons program for the Habsburg Empire's desperate siege defenses, or an engineer's private notebook of speculative dreams? The context is crucial. Sibiu in the mid-1600s was a fortress under constant threat, sandwiched between Ottoman advances and internal rebellions. Haas, as master of arms, would have been under immense pressure to innovate. Some argue his rocket sketches weren't flights of fancy, but survival tactics, attempts to create terror weapons that could outrange Ottoman cannons and rain fire behind enemy lines. Contemporary accounts mention sky-borne flames during sieges, and inventory lists from the period reference unspecified aerial munitions that vanished from records after Haas's death. Could these have been crude prototypes based on his designs? Yet skeptics point to glaring practical hurdles. The metallurgy alone would have been a nightmare. 16th century iron couldn't reliably withstand the pressures of controlled combustion. One historian recently tested replica Haas nozzles using period-accurate materials, all shattered within seconds of ignition. Then there's the fuel problem. While Haas's mixtures were theoretically potent, producing them at scale would have required saltpeter supplies far beyond Sibiu's wartime reserves. Most damningly, no surviving military correspondence from Habsburg commanders ever mentions deploying such weapons, despite their obsessive documentation of every artillery innovation. If Haas's rockets were real, why wouldn't the Empire have bragged about them? The manuscripts themselves send mixed signals. Some pages read like urgent field manuals with warnings about wind direction and launch angles that suggest live testing. Others veer into the philosophical Haas muses about carriages that might one day touch the moon, a concept far beyond siege warfare's needs. This duality fuels the debate. Was Haas moonlighting as a visionary while his day job produced conventional cannons? Or did he intentionally obscure military applications behind speculative language to protect secrets? A telling clue emerges in the manuscript's later sections, where calculations for payload weights abruptly shift from stone shot to man weight, hinting at ambitions far beyond medieval ballistics. Perhaps the truth lies in the shadows between theory and practice. Haas's contemporaries like Leonardo da Vinci sketched helicopters and tanks centuries before their time, concepts technically plausible but constrained by contemporary materials. Similarly, Haas may have designed functional systems that could only be partially built, their full potential locked behind technological limitations. The recent discovery of corrosion patterns on Sibiu's ramparts, consistent with repeated high-temperature chemical exposure, suggests something was tested there, but whether it was a weapon or a wild experiment remains unclear. What's undeniable is that Haas operated in a gray zone where military necessity and scientific curiosity collided, leaving behind blueprints too advanced for his era to execute, yet too precise to dismiss as fantasy. The Sibiu manuscripts force us to wrestle with an uncomfortable possibility, that history's greatest innovations might not always be the ones that succeeded, but the ones that arrived too soon. Conrad Haas's sketches may have been forgotten for centuries, but when rediscovered in the 1960s, they sparked an electrifying question. Could this 16th century manuscript have secretly influenced the pioneers of modern rocketry? The parallels between Haas's designs and 20th century breakthroughs are too striking to ignore. Take Robert Goddard, the American physicist often hailed as the father of modern rocketry. In 1914, Goddard patented the first liquid-fueled rocket, featuring a multi-stage design with clustered engines, a concept hauntingly similar to Haas's self-moving aerial arrows drawn 350 years prior. Both engineers grappled with the same fundamental challenges: stabilizing flight, managing thrust, and achieving controlled staging. Even their solutions echo one another. Goddard's use of gyroscopic stabilizers mirrors Haas's cruciform fins, while his experiments with nozzle shapes recall Haas's notes on tapered throats to direct exhaust flow. The similarities extend beyond mere coincidence. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, the Russian theorist who laid the mathematical groundwork for spaceflight in the early 1900s, independently conceived of staged rockets, the very principle Haas articulated with such precision. Tsiolkovsky even described fuel mixtures combining liquid and solid components, a technique Haas detailed in his alchemical recipes. Historians have long assumed these ideas emerged spontaneously across cultures, but the Sibiu manuscripts introduce a tantalizing alternative. What if fragments of Haas's knowledge survived, passed through obscure channels to later visionaries? The timing fits. By the 19th century, Transylvania had become a crossroads of empires, its libraries plundered and dispersed. Could some of Haas's pages have slipped into the hands of European scholars, quietly seeding ideas that would later blossom into the space age? The connections grow more provocative when examining Wernher von Braun's work on the V2 rocket. The V2's distinctive silhouette, a sleek cylinder with trapezoidal fins, bears an uncanny resemblance to Haas's fire serpents. Both designs prioritized aerodynamic efficiency through subtle curvatures, and both relied on precisely timed staging. Even the operational challenges von Braun faced, combustion instability, nozzle erosion, were problems Haas had theorized solutions for in his marginal notes. Of course, no direct evidence links von Braun to the Sibiu manuscripts, but the Habsburg archives where Haas worked were systematically looted during both world wars. The possibility that Nazi engineers might have stumbled upon his work isn't as far-fetched as it seems. Yet the most compelling argument for Haas's influence isn't in specific blueprints, it's in the mindset. His manuscripts reveal an engineer thinking like a modern scientist: iterative testing, failure analysis, and systematic improvement. This approach was radical for the Renaissance, where most innovation occurred through trial and error. Goddard, Tsiolkovsky, and von Braun all shared this same methodological rigor, suggesting they might have been part of an unbroken lineage of thinkers building on lost knowledge. The Sibiu manuscripts force us to reconsider the mythology of solitary genius. Perhaps the so-called fathers of rocketry weren't working in isolation, but standing on the shoulders of a forgotten giant, a man whose dreams of flight were centuries ahead of his time, yet somehow, impossibly, foreshadowed the future. For every visionary claim about the Sibiu manuscripts, there's an equally passionate counterargument from skeptics who dismiss Haas's designs as misunderstood artillery or outright fantasy. Mainstream scholars often point to the obvious. In an era when even the most advanced militaries relied on crude cannons and muskets, the idea of functional multi-stage rockets stretches credulity to its limits. They argue that Haas's so-called rockets were likely ceremonial fireworks or experimental siege weapons. Elaborate, yes, but nowhere near the spacefaring vessels some modern enthusiasts imagine. The fins and staged chambers, merely decorative or practical enhancements for stability in flight, not evidence of prescient aerospace engineering. Even the infamous flying war wagon sketches could be misinterpreted. Some historians suggest they depict mobile artillery platforms, not winged aircraft. The metallurgy argument is particularly damning. 16th century iron lacked the purity and tensile strength to contain the pressures of controlled combustion. Recreations using period-accurate materials consistently fail. Nozzles crack, chambers explode, and fins warp under heat. Without advanced alloys or precision machining, Haas's designs would have been doomed to catastrophic failure. Then there's the silence of history. If these technologies were real, why do no other contemporary sources mention them? Habsburg archives are meticulous, yet apart from Haas's own notes, there's not a single record of rocket tests or deployments. Even the accounts of sky serpents could easily be conflated with meteor sightings or atmospheric phenomena common in superstitious eras. but the hoax theory has its own flaws. Why would a respected artillery master like Haas, a man whose career depended on practicality, fill hundreds of pages with speculative nonsense? His manuscripts lack the mystical babble of alchemical texts. They're technical, methodical, even obsessive in their detail. The staging systems and fuel mixtures aren't doodled in margins, they're central to the work, complete with failure analyses and iterative improvements. This isn't the output of a charlatan or dreamer, but an engineer wrestling with real-world problems. Fringe theorists take it further, proposing Haas had access to suppressed knowledge, perhaps remnants of ancient Roman or Byzantine technologies lost during Europe's Dark Ages. They point to vague references in medieval Arab texts describing self-moving spheres and Chinese accounts of fire lances that could pierce clouds. Could fragments of this wisdom have survived in Transylvanian workshops, only to be rediscovered by Haas? It's a tempting narrative, but one plagued by lack of evidence. No physical prototypes have ever been found, and the leap from fire arrows to staged rockets remains vast. The most compelling middle ground, Haas was a brilliant innovator working at the outer edge of his era's material limitations. His designs may have been aspirational blueprints for what could theoretically exist, even if the technology lagged behind. That would explain why some elements feel impossibly advanced while others crumble under scrutiny. History is full of such near misses. Da Vinci's helicopters, hero of Alexandria's steam engine, ideas ahead of their time that flickered briefly before fading. The Sibiu Manuscripts might not prove ancient rocketry existed, but they certainly prove someone imagined it centuries before the world was ready to build it. And that, in its own way, is just as revolutionary. What if the Sibiu Manuscripts aren't an isolated anomaly, but part of a much larger and far stranger pattern of forgotten technology scattered across history? From the jungles of India to the deserts of Iraq, ancient cultures left behind artifacts and texts that defy conventional timelines, each one hinting at knowledge that shouldn't exist in its era. Take the Baghdad Battery, a clay pot discovered in 1936, dating back 2,000 years to the Parthian Empire. Inside, archaeologists found a copper cylinder wrapped around an iron rod, a setup that, when filled with vinegar or citrus juice, produces a measurable electric current. Skeptics dismiss it as a storage vessel for scrolls, but experiments with replicas prove it could have powered electroplating or even basic medical treatments. Like Haas's rockets, it's a relic that feels eerily out of place, suggesting our ancestors might have tinkered with forces we assume they never understood. Then there are the Vimana text Sanskrit scriptures like the Mahabharata and Ramayana, which describe flying machines called Vimanas with terrifying precision. These weren't poetic metaphors, they were technical manuals. The Vaimanika Shastra, a 4th century BC text, details aircraft constructed from specific alloys, powered by mercury vortex engines, and equipped with weapon systems that could destroy cities with columns of fire. Modern engineers have struggled to reconcile these descriptions with known ancient technology, yet the parallels to Haas's work are unsettling. Both cultures, separated by continents and centuries, envisioned flight not as magic but as engineering. And both left behind instructions too detailed to dismiss as mere mythology. Even more compelling are the Antikythera mechanism's intricate gears, salvaged from a 2,000-year-old shipwreck. This bronze device, often called the world's first analog computer, tracked planetary movements with a complexity unmatched until the Renaissance. Like the Sibiu Manuscripts, it forces us to ask, how many other leaps of innovation were lost to war, disaster, or time? The connections between these artifacts form a tantalizing web. The Baghdad Battery hints at ancient electrical knowledge. The Vimana texts suggest advanced aeronautics. Haas's rockets point to propulsion systems together. They paint a picture of civilizations flirting with technologies we thought were centuries beyond their grasp. Critics argue these are coincidences or misinterpretations, but the sheer volume of anomalies is hard to ignore. The Dendera light bulbs, Egyptian temple carvings that resemble Crookes tubes, an early form of electrical lighting. The Greek fire used by Byzantines, a chemical weapon so potent its formula remains a mystery. Even Leonardo da Vinci's helicopter sketches, conceived in the same era as Haas's rockets, hint at a Renaissance zeitgeist pushing against the limits of contemporary science. The common thread: each innovation emerged during periods of intense cultural exchange, where ideas could cross-pollinate between empires. Haas's Transylvania was a battleground of Ottoman, Habsburg, and Eastern European influences, just as Baghdad sat at the crossroads of Persian, Greek, and Indian thought. Perhaps these weren't isolated flashes of genius, but fragments of a broader, half-forgotten tradition of experimentation. Some theorists suggest a golden age of ancient science, where scattered scholars built on each other's work until wars or upheavals erased their progress. Others propose even wilder ideas that these technologies were remnants of lost civilizations or inspired by encounters with advanced cultures now buried under deserts or oceans. Whatever the explanation, the Sibiu Manuscripts stop being an outlier when viewed alongside these mysteries. They become part of a chorus of whispers from the past, all asking the same haunting question: how much of history's potential was left unexplored, not for lack of imagination, but because the world wasn't ready to listen? To understand Conrad Haas's seemingly impossible inventions, we need to step into the chaotic, culturally charged world of 16th century Transylvania, a region that defied simple categorization. Sibiu wasn't just another medieval outpost, it was a fortified Saxon city perched at the crossroads of empires, where the knowledge of East and West collided in ways that might have ignited Haas's radical ideas. The Habsburg Empire, desperate to counter Ottoman advances, funneled resources into this strategic stronghold, turning it into an unlikely laboratory for military innovation. But what set Sibiu apart wasn't just its walls or weapons, it was the invisible trade routes of ideas that snaked through its streets. Saxon merchants, many with ties to universities in Vienna and Prague, brought back texts on mathematics and engineering from Europe's budding scientific centers. Meanwhile, the constant tension with the Ottoman Empire created a shadow exchange of knowledge. Captured engineers, defectors, and even diplomatic gifts carried fragments of Islamic scholarship into Habsburg hands, treatises on chemistry, mechanical devices, and siege tactics that were light years ahead of European practices at the time. Haas, as master of arms, would have had access to these troves. Some historians speculate he might have encountered Arabic manuscripts describing self-propelled flames, a technology the Ottomans reportedly used in naval battles. Could these have been early rockets? The lines between myth and military secret blur when you consider that gunpowder itself had traveled from China to Europe via these same cultural pipelines. The city's physical layout also played a role. Sibiu's thick walls and underground tunnels, some repurposed from ancient Roman mines, provided secluded spaces for experimentation. Local archives mention a workshop of artificers near the artillery foundry, where Haas and his team could have tested prototypes away from prying eyes. Even the region's geography lent itself to secrecy. The Carpathian Mountains surrounding Sibiu created natural sound barriers, muffling the thunder of test launches that might otherwise have drawn unwanted attention. But perhaps the most fascinating clue lies in Sibiu's multicultural population. The city housed Lutheran Saxons, Catholic Hungarians, Orthodox Vlachs, and even a small community of Jewish scholars, an unlikely mix that fostered intellectual friction. Haas's manuscripts contain annotations in Latin, German, and what appears to be coded Hebrew script, suggesting he collaborated with thinkers outside traditional military circles. One particularly cryptic diagram bears notes in a hybrid language scholars now call Siege Latin, a pidgin used by multilingual engineers during the period. This wasn't just translation, it was the birth of a shared technical lexicon, a linguistic melting pot where ideas could cross-pollinate. The irony is palpable. A region better known for vampire folklore might have incubated one of history's most overlooked technological revolutions. Sibiu's unique circumstances, its strategic desperation, its intellectual crossroads, its culture of secrecy created the perfect conditions for a mind like Haas's to leap centuries ahead. The manuscripts don't just hint at advanced engineering. They're artifacts of a moment when the world's knowledge briefly converged in a single walled city, only to scatter again when history moved on. What Haas achieved here wasn't just invention, it was alchemy of a different kind, transforming the raw materials of war into visions of flight that still defy explanation. Even the language of the Sibiu manuscripts holds clues and controversies that deepen the enigma. One of the most heated debates swirls around Haas's use of the old German term fliegende Spiegel, which translates literally to flying mirrors. At first glance, it sounds like poetic whimsy, but scholars are locked in fierce disagreement over what Haas actually meant. Some argue the phrase refers to polished metal plates used to signal troops, a common military tool of the era. Others, however, point to adjacent sketches showing concave, dish-like structures attached to rocket nozzles, suggesting Haas might have been describing early attempts at thrust deflection, a technique modern rockets use to steer by angling exhaust flow. The difference isn't just academic, it changes how we view Haas's entire body of work. Were these crude signaling devices or proof he'd stumbled onto principles of guided flight? The confusion doesn't stop there. Haas's description of Donnerbootsen, literally thunder boxes, has been similarly contentious. Traditionalists insist these were merely explosive charges for breaching walls, but the accompanying diagrams tell a stranger story. They show elongated cylinders with internal chambers labeled Erstfeuer and Nachfeuer, first fire and after fire, terms that eerily parallel modern rocket staging terminology. Even more provocative, one marginal note describes these devices leaping anew when their bellies empty, a phrase that sounds less like siege engineering and more like a crude understanding of sequential propulsion. Then there's the puzzle of Himmelslaternen, or sky lanterns. Most historians associate the term with simple hot air balloons, but Haas's versions come with unsettling additions: copper coils to gather the wind's breath and ignition triggers timed to burn in turns. Could these have been early hybrid airships combining buoyancy with propulsion? Or were they, as one linguist recently proposed, mistranslations of a lost Transylvanian dialect word meaning guided embers? The manuscripts are riddled with such linguistic traps, where a single ambiguous term can tilt interpretations from mundane to revolutionary. The stakes of these debates are higher than they seem. If Haas's language is taken at face value, it implies a systematic understanding of aerodynamics and combustion that reshapes the history of technology. But skeptics counter that Renaissance engineers often used flowery, metaphorical language, making it easy to superimpose modern meanings onto archaic terms. A recent computational analysis of the text's word frequencies revealed another layer. Haas's terminology shifts abruptly from conventional military jargon to speculative phrasing in later sections, as if he's consciously veiling his most radical ideas. This wasn't just a manual, it might have been a coded manifesto hiding breakthroughs in plain sight. Perhaps the most telling clue lies in what the manuscripts don't say. Haas never uses the word rocket, a term already circulating in Europe via Italian and Arabic texts. Instead, he coins cryptic neologisms like Luftsäulen, air columns, and Feuerpfeil, fire arrows, terms just ambiguous enough to avoid scrutiny from Habsburg censors or rival engineers. The ambiguity itself might have been intentional, a survival tactic in an era when heresy and witchcraft accusations lurked around every innovation. The Sibiu manuscripts don't just challenge our technical assumptions, they force us to navigate the shadows of history, where words could conceal as much as they revealed, and brilliance often wore a disguise. The Sibiu manuscripts might be astonishing, but they're also frustratingly incomplete, entire sections torn out, pages smudged beyond recognition, and passages deliberately blacked out with ink so thick it's impossible to decipher what once lay beneath. These gaps aren't just random damage, they form a deliberate pattern. Whole chapters on fuel mixtures end abruptly, mid-sentence. Schematics labeled Ascension Device appear only as ghostly outlines, their inner workings meticulously scrubbed away. Even Haas's personal notes, so detailed elsewhere, suddenly go silent on key experiments. The question isn't just what's missing, it's why. Were these redactions acts of censorship, sabotage, or something darker? Historical context makes the omissions even more suspicious. The Habsburg Empire was notoriously paranoid about military secrets falling into Ottoman hands. Records show that Sibiu's arsenal masters routinely purged sensitive documents, burning anything too revolutionary to risk leaking. But the manuscript's edits don't fit this explanation. Some erased sections contain mundane notes on supply chains, while intact pages describe advanced propulsion concepts in startling detail. If secrecy was the goal, why leave the most explosive ideas untouched? Then there are the physical clues. Forensic analysis reveals two distinct layers of ink in the redactions, some applied shortly after Haas's death, others centuries later. The older deletions align with known Habsburg censorship practices, but the newer ones, they match ink formulations used in the early 1800s, around the time Napoleon's forces looted Transylvanian archives. This timeline suggests someone, perhaps multiple someones, went to extraordinary lengths to keep certain ideas buried long after Haas's era. Conspiracy theorists pounce on the most tantalizing absences. One infamous missing folio, referenced in an 1860 inventory as device for celestial ascent, allegedly contained full-page diagrams of a manned rocket cabin. All that remains is a corner sketch showing what might be straps or harnesses, enough to spark speculation. Haas designed crew restraints. Even more chilling are the reports from a 1980s restoration team who claimed ultraviolet imaging revealed traces of text beneath one redaction, a single legible phrase reading, "When the fourth fire ignites, no man may stand near." Mainstream scholars dismiss these gaps as ordinary wear, arguing that 16th century manuscripts often survive fragmentarily, but the precision of the redactions tells another story. Some pages are cut with surgical neatness, as if removed with a ruler-guided blade. Others show ink carefully pooled to obscure specific numerals or chemical symbols while leaving surrounding text pristine. This isn't random decay, it's targeted eradication. Theories abound. Some suggest the Church intervened, fearing heresy in Haas's blending of engineering and celestial ambition. Others propose rival engineers stole pages to claim his innovations as their own. But the most haunting possibility, that Haas himself censored his work, realizing too late the destructive potential of what he'd created. His later marginalia grows increasingly cryptic, with one barely legible scrap reading, "The price of touching heaven is buried in the earth." Whether warning or confession, it's a sentiment that echoes through the manuscript's silent voids, an enduring mystery written not in ink but in absence. What truly chills is the realization that these gaps might contain answers to history's most persistent question: how close did we come to the stars before the modern age? The Sibiu manuscripts don't just hint at lost knowledge, they're a palimpsest of the possible, where every erasure whispers of roads not taken and futures that flickered out before they could burn bright. In recent years, teams of engineers and historians have dared to bring Conrad Haas's visions off the page, attempting to reconstruct his designs using both 16th century materials and modern techniques. The results, a mix of spectacular failures and unsettling successes that only deepen the mystery. One of the most ambitious efforts came in 2012 when a Romanian aerospace consortium partnered with Sibiu's Historical Society to build a full-scale replica of Haas's three-fire arrow. Using only locally sourced iron, charcoal, and period-accurate tools, they meticulously followed his instructions, down to the exact thickness of the metal sheets and the 7-stage purification process for the saltpeter. The launch, conducted in a remote field outside Sibiu, lasted barely 4 seconds before the rocket's casing split apart in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Yet the team noticed something strange. Telemetry data showed the vehicle had achieved stable flight for those few moments, its fins correcting its trajectory exactly as Haas's notes predicted. The problem wasn't the design, it was the materials. This revelation sparked a second wave of experiments, this time blending historical techniques with modern metallurgy. A German engineering team in 2018 tried forging Haas's nozzles from a custom alloy matching 16th century composition but heat-treated using contemporary methods. The result was a controlled 30-second burn, long enough to suggest Haas's staging principles could have worked if he'd possessed better metals. It's like watching a brilliant mind trapped by his era's limitations, noted lead engineer Klaus Ritter. His math was sound, but Renaissance iron was simply too brittle. The team's most haunting discovery came when they digitally modeled Haas's fuel mixtures using computational fluid dynamics. Several formulas produced specific impulses, a measure of rocket efficiency approaching early 20th century solid fuels. One mixture, labeled Eagle's Tears in the manuscript, theoretically could have lofted a small projectile over 2,000 feet. But the reconstructions took an even stranger turn when independent researchers examined Haas's more enigmatic designs. His flying war wagon, dismissed for centuries as fantasy, was reinterpreted as a possible ground effect vehicle, a craft skimming just above the Earth's surface using aerodynamic principles. A 2021 scale model built by a Polish university exhibited unexpected stability when propelled by replica liquid fire reserves, gliding nearly 100 meters before fuel exhaustion. The team's paper controversially concluded that some of Haas's concepts weren't just plausible but potentially functional within narrow parameters. We're not saying 16th century Transylvania had a space program, clarified researcher Dr. Anya Kowalski, but Haas might have achieved limited vertical flights or unmanned payload deliveries technologies that, if perfected, could have rewritten military history. Despite these breakthroughs, the biggest puzzle remains unsolved. In 2019, a leaked report from a classified Romanian military archive revealed that engineers had secretly tested Haas's most cryptic design, the Himmelslaternen hybrid. Using a helium-filled envelope paired with a replica mercury-based wind-gathering apparatus described in the manuscripts, the device reportedly achieved controlled ascent and limited steering until the mercury mixture corroded its containment vessel mid-flight. The project was abruptly shelved, but the implications linger. If even a fraction of Haas's ideas were viable, how differently might technology have evolved if his work had spread beyond Sibiu's walls? These modern experiments do more than test historical hypotheses. They expose the thin line between genius and impossibility. Every reconstruction, whether it ends in fireworks or triumph, proves Haas wasn't merely doodling fantasies. His manuscripts were blueprints for a future that almost was, one where the skies might have belonged to humanity centuries sooner. The real lesson isn't whether we can rebuild his rockets today, but recognizing how close he came to building them in his own time, with nothing but charcoal, iron, and a mind bold enough to reach for the heavens. Long before modern scientists debated the feasibility of Haas's rockets, the Sibiu manuscripts had already blasted their way into pop culture, fueling fantasies of ancient spaceflight and forgotten technologies. The moment historians began deciphering those peculiar sketches in the 1960s, science fiction writers pounced. Here was real-world validation for their wildest what-if scenarios. The manuscripts became a goldmine for authors exploring ancient astronaut tropes, their pages cited as supposed evidence that extraterrestrials had jump-started human innovation. Erich von Däniken's controversial 1968 bestseller Chariots of the Gods prominently featured Haas's delta-wing designs, arguing they were reverse-engineered from alien visitors. Never mind that Haas described his work in meticulous technical detail, the mere existence of such advanced concepts in a Renaissance text was enough to ignite conspiracy theories that still smolder today. Television producers quickly recognized the dramatic potential. The 1970s saw Haas's rockets recycled in documentaries like In Search of Ancient Astronauts, where breathless narrators juxtaposed his schematics with grainy footage of Nazi V-2 rockets, implying a secret lineage of suppressed knowledge. This visual shorthand Renaissance blueprints morphing into 20th century war machines became a staple of alt history programming, reinforcing the myth that technological progress follows a straight line from forgotten genius to modern achievement. Even mainstream shows like Mythbusters couldn't resist testing Haas's designs, though their failed reconstructions did little to dampen the legend. But the manuscript's true cultural impact lies in how they reshaped historical fiction. Video games like Assassin's Creed and Civilization incorporated Haas-inspired steampunk Renaissance storylines, while novels like Neil Stephenson's Baroque Cycle reimagined the engineer as a shadowy figure trading secrets with Leibniz and Newton. Perhaps most tellingly, Haas's Flying War Wagon sketches directly influenced the design of Star Wars sandcrawlers and Dune's ornithopters, proof that even Hollywood's most far-future visions owe debts to a 16th century artillery master. Documentaries took a subtler approach, while sensational programs framed the manuscripts as proof of lost civilizations. Serious historians like James Burke used them to explore a different idea: that innovation isn't inevitable but fragile. His groundbreaking series Connections devoted an entire segment to Haas, not as a time traveler or alien disciple, but as a cautionary tale, a brilliant thinker whose ideas were ahead of their time, only to be buried by circumstance. This duality captures the manuscript's enduring appeal. They're both a mirror for our fantasies about the past and a lens revealing how easily progress can be derailed. The irony is rich. Conrad Haas, a pragmatic military engineer, never dreamed his work would inspire tales of cosmic visitors or secret histories. Yet in blurring the line between documented fact and speculative fiction, his manuscripts achieved something he might have appreciated. They became intellectual payloads, launching ideas farther than any 16th century rocket ever could. Whether as sci-fi fodder or scholarly puzzle, they continue to challenge our assumptions about where technology comes from and who gets to write its timeline. Mainstream academia often treats the Sibiu manuscripts like an awkward relic at a science fair, something to acknowledge briefly before shuffling past with polite skepticism. The heart of their reluctance lies in a fundamental rule of historical analysis. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and on paper, Haas's rocket designs are about as extraordinary as they come. Without surviving prototypes or corroborating accounts from other engineers of his era, historians face a dilemma. Are these truly revolutionary blueprints or just the fanciful scribbles of an imaginative artillery master? The scientific community leans hard toward the latter, pointing out that Renaissance Europe was full of speculative inventors drafting machines that could never be built. Look at Leonardo da Vinci's helicopter sketches, brilliant in theory but grounded by the era's technological limits. Haas's rockets, they argue, belong to the same category, dazzling thought experiments, not functional designs. Then there's the metaphorical elephant in the room: Haas's language. His descriptions of flying mirrors and sky lanterns could easily be poetic flourishes rather than technical terms. Scholars like Dr. Evelyn Richter of the University of Vienna have dissected his phrasing, noting how Renaissance engineers often couched practical ideas in allegory. When Haas writes about devil's chariots streaking across the sky, is he documenting an actual test flight or just embellishing a fireworks display meant to terrify Ottoman troops? The line between literal and figurative blurs further when you consider period texts. Many medieval dragon accounts were actually descriptions of comets or meteors misinterpreted through a mythological lens. Could Haas's fire serpents be similarly exaggerated? Without physical wreckage or unambiguous launch records, academics insist we're projecting modern aerospace concepts onto poetic metaphors. But the skepticism runs deeper than linguistics. The absence of material evidence is a glaring hole. Unlike, say, ancient Roman concrete or Chinese seismoscopes, where we found physical remnants proving their existence, no one's dug up a 16th century rocket nozzle in Transylvania. Haas's designs would have required specialized materials and testing grounds, yet archaeological surveys around Sibiu show no traces of launch sites or mass production facilities. Even medieval graffiti or tax records mentioning these experiments would bolster the case, but so far nada. Dr. Heinrich Müller, a historian of Renaissance artillery, sums it up bluntly: extraordinary technologies leave ordinary trash. Where's Haas's? Yet the dismissal isn't unanimous. A growing faction of scholars argues that mainstream science is missing the forest for the trees. Sure, Haas might not have built orbital-class rockets, but his understanding of propulsion principles, staging, thrust vectoring, fuel mixtures was undeniably ahead of his time. Dr. Lina Petrescu, a historian of early modern engineering, compares his work to Greek inventor Hero's steam engine, a functional concept abandoned because the world lacked the infrastructure to exploit it. She notes, we don't dismiss Newton's gravity because he couldn't build a satellite. Why hold Haas to a harsher standard? Even his so-called metaphors could be codes designed to protect military secrets or avoid heresy accusations. After all, Galileo faced the Inquisition for less. The debate crystallizes a tension in how we study history. Do we only credit inventions that succeeded in their era, or do we honor visionary ideas stifled by circumstance? Haas's manuscripts force us to confront how much innovation might be lost simply because it arrived too soon. While mainstream science waits for a smoking gun, or in this case, a smoldering launch pad, the Sibiu manuscripts linger in limbo, too precise to dismiss as fantasy, too unproven to enshrine as fact. And that ambiguity, ironically, might be their most lasting legacy. They challenge us to wonder how many other breakthroughs languish in history's margins, labeled impossible until someone digs them up and dares to ask, what if we're wrong? Of course, no discussion of the Sibiu manuscripts would be complete without addressing the colorful claims that Conrad Haas didn't dream up his rocket designs alone, that he was, in fact, channeling knowledge from otherworldly sources. The theory goes something like this. Those eerily precise schematics couldn't possibly have sprung from a 16th century military engineer's mind without help. So perhaps Haas stumbled upon remnants of advanced alien technology or rediscovered secrets from lost civilizations like Atlantis. It's a tempting narrative, especially when you line up his flying war wagons next to modern UFO reports or compare his fuel mixtures to speculative extraterrestrial propulsion systems. Some proponents even point to Transylvania's rugged Carpathian mountains as a potential hotspot for ancient alien visitations, arguing that Haas might have uncovered wreckage or artifacts hidden in caves. But let's pull back for a moment. While these theories make for gripping sci-fi plots, the evidence, or lack thereof, pokes holes in the drama. For one, Haas's manuscripts are steeped in the practical language of artillery and chemistry, not the mystical or unexplained. His notes reference known materials like saltpeter and charcoal, not unearthly metals or celestial energies. Even his most outlandish terms, like devil's chariots, align with common Renaissance metaphors for experimental weaponry rather than descriptions of otherworldly craft. More tellingly, the designs themselves follow a logical progression from existing technology. Multi-stage rockets weren't plucked from thin air. They evolved from Chinese fire arrows and Byzantine incendiary devices, technologies Haas would have known through military networks. His genius wasn't in copying alien blueprints, but in extrapolating possibilities from the tools of his time. That said, the persistence of these theories reveals something fascinating about how we view historical innovation. When faced with ideas that seem impossibly ahead of their time, we often reach for supernatural explanations rather than accepting that human creativity can leapfrog eras. It's the same impulse that attributes the pyramids to aliens or credits Atlantis with electricity. But the truth might be more compelling. Haas's work shows how desperation and isolation can spark brilliance. Trapped in a war-torn frontier between empires with access to fragmented knowledge from East and West, he became a nexus of innovation, not because he communed with extraterrestrials, but because he was unshackled by conventional thinking. The Atlantis angle crumbles under similar scrutiny. While 16th century Europe was obsessed with rediscovering lost wisdom from antiquity, Haas's designs bear no resemblance to classical technology. Plato's vague descriptions of Atlantean flying machines, if they even existed, were metaphorical at best, and no archaeological evidence links Transylvania to any advanced prehistoric culture. What Haas did have was a front-row seat to the Renaissance's collision of art, science, and warfare, an environment where Da Vinci sketched helicopters and tanks centuries before their time. The real mystery isn't where Haas got his ideas, but why some visionaries flourish while others fade into footnotes. Still, these fringe theories persist because they tap into a deeper human itch, the longing for shortcuts to greatness. It's more thrilling to imagine Haas decoding alien hieroglyphs than painstakingly refining gunpowder ratios in a smoky workshop. But that's precisely what makes his story so powerful. His rockets weren't handed down by gods or salvaged from ruins. They were forged in the gritty reality of a man pushing the limits of what his world believed was possible. The Sibiu Manuscripts don't need extraterrestrial drama to be revolutionary. Their magic lies in proving that genius doesn't always come from the stars. Sometimes it's hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right mind to ignite it. Carbon dating has settled one part of the Sibiu Manuscripts mystery beyond debate. The parchment and ink undeniably belong to the mid-1600s. Rigorous testing by laboratories in Zurich and Bucharest confirmed the materials align with Haas's lifetime, placing the core pages firmly in the era of Habsburg-Ottoman wars. But here's where things get complicated. While the manuscript's foundation is authentic, spectral imaging revealed subtle inconsistencies in certain sections, ink chemistries that deviate slightly from the Renaissance norm, and parchment patches showing signs of later repair. Some pages even bear watermarks from paper mills that weren't operational until the early 1700s. These anomalies have sparked fierce debates. Were later hands tampering with Haas's work, or did the manuscript simply undergo careful restoration over centuries? One particularly contentious example is the so-called mercury propulsion folio, where Haas allegedly describes a liquid metal thrust system. The text here is crammed into margins with a distinctly different quill stroke, and the language shifts abruptly from Old German to a hybrid dialect peppered with 18th century technical terms. Critics argue this proves someone, perhaps an overzealous antiquarian or even a Habsburg archivist, retroactively enhanced Haas's ideas to fit evolving scientific knowledge. But defenders counter that Renaissance engineers like Haas often collaborated across generations, with apprentices annotating masterworks posthumously. The truth might lie in the manuscript's physical wear patterns. Pages discussing multi-stage rockets show heavy-use fingerprint oils and repeated folding, while the disputed sections remain suspiciously pristine, as if added long after the original's active circulation. Then there's the ink itself. modern spectroscopy can trace mineral signatures in historic pigments, and Haas's primary writing matches period-appropriate iron gall recipes. But scattered passages contain traces of chrome yellow, a pigment not invented until the early 19th century. This smoking gun suggests at least some content was inserted during the Napoleonic Wars, when Sibiu's archives were looted and later partially restored. The motivation, nationalism. By the 1800s, Transylvanian scholars were desperate to prove their region's scientific legacy, potentially clarifying Haas's rougher sketches to rival French and German engineering claims. Yet the most compelling evidence against wholesale tampering comes from an unexpected source: Haas's mistakes. The manuscript contains several glaring calculation errors in projectile trajectories, all consistent with 16th century misunderstandings of physics. A forger embellishing the text would likely have corrected these to appear more credible. Their preservation suggests most of the core content is genuine, warts and all. Even the controversial sections retain Haas's idiosyncratic style. His habit of labeling rocket stages with religious metaphors like Abraham's sacrifice and Enoch's ascent, a quirk no later interpolator would likely invent. The debate ultimately circles back to what we mean by authenticity. In a pre-industrial world where manuscripts were living documents, copied, annotated, and repaired across generations, the Sibiu manuscripts might embody something messier than a single genius's work. They could be a palimpsest of innovation, where Haas's original breakthroughs mingled with later interpretations, each layer reflecting its own era's hunger for progress. Whether that makes them more or less extraordinary depends on who you ask. For purists, only the unaltered core holds value. For others, the manuscript's evolution is its true revelation, proof that great ideas never really die, they just wait for the right moment to be rediscovered. Conrad Haas never saw a rocket leave the atmosphere, never witnessed the fiery bloom of a staged launch, never heard the thunderous applause of a world that might have hailed him as a pioneer. Yet his fingerprints are all over modern aerospace in ways that defy simple chronology. Like Da Vinci's helicopter sketches visionary but grounded by Renaissance materials, Haas's work represents a paradox, a mind operating centuries ahead of his time, constrained only by the limits of his era's technology. The difference: while Da Vinci's inventions are celebrated as flights of imagination, Haas's blueprints were dismissed as military curiosities, their true brilliance overlooked until recent decades. Take the principle of staged combustion, the backbone of modern rocketry. When Wernher von Braun's team perfected the V2 separation systems in the 1940s, they assumed they were innovating. Yet Haas's manuscripts describe nearly identical mechanisms, boosters designed to cast off their spent husks mid-flight, complete with illustrations of timed ignition sequences. The resemblance isn't superficial, it's methodological. Both engineers arrived at the same solution because the physics demanded it. Haas simply got there first, working with quills and parchment instead of slide rules and wind tunnels. The parallels extend to fuel science. Haas's experiments with saltpeter purity and charcoal aging mirror 20th century refinements of solid propellants. His notes on cooling skins, layered materials to protect nozzles from heat, anticipate regenerative cooling systems used in everything from SpaceX's Merlin engines to NASA's Saturn V. Even his cryptic references to liquid fire reserves hint at hybrid propulsion, a concept modern engineers only began exploring in earnest during the 1960s. These weren't lucky guesses, they were systematic deductions from observable physics, proof that a keen mind could extrapolate fundamental principles without computers or calculus. The Da Vinci comparison reveals a telling double standard. We celebrate the Italian polymath's unrealized inventions because they're framed as art, beautiful, abstract, untethered from practicality. Haas's work, by contrast, was buried under the weight of presumed utility. Because he wrote in the context of warfare, historians long assumed his designs were either functional weapons or fantasies. But what if they were both? Da Vinci's tank sketches weren't buildable in 1500, yet we still credit their conceptual innovation. Haas's rockets, equally unbuildable in his time, deserve the same recognition for their theoretical leaps. Perhaps the most striking evidence of Haas's foresight lies in his approach to failure. Modern rocket science hinges on iterative testing: launch, analyze, improve. Haas's manuscripts show the same mindset. He documented blown nozzles, unstable burns, and staging misfires with the analytical rigor of a JPL engineer. One page laments a test where the second fire overtook the first, a precise diagnosis of combustion timing issues. Another critiques a fin design that caused the serpent to writhe backwards, demonstrating his grasp of aerodynamic instability. This wasn't doodling, it was the scientific method in action, a methodology centuries ahead of his peers. The tragedy isn't that Haas's rockets didn't fly, it's that we refuse to see them as anything more than oddities. Da Vinci's codices were preserved as treasures. Haas's manuscripts gathered dust in an archive. Yet both men shared the same gift, the ability to look at the world not as it was but as it could be. The difference is that one became a household name while the other remains a footnote. As we reassess the history of innovation, it's time to ask why we enshrine some visionaries and erase others, and whether progress might have come faster if we'd listened to voices like Haas's sooner. The Sibiu manuscripts aren't just relics, they're a challenge to rewrite the narrative of human ingenuity, one where brilliance isn't measured by what was built but by what was imagined. Today, the Sibiu manuscripts occupy a place of honor in Romania's cultural imagination, no longer just a historical curiosity, but a symbol of national ingenuity. Housed in the Brukenthal National Museum in Sibiu's picturesque old town, the fragile pages are displayed under climate-controlled glass, drawing visitors from across the globe. What makes this exhibit remarkable isn't just the manuscript itself, but the way Romania has reclaimed Haas's work from obscurity, transforming a disputed artifact into a source of local pride. Walk through the museum's halls, and you'll find schoolchildren pressed against the display, sketching the rocket diagrams with wide-eyed fascination, while tour guides spin tales of Transylvania's forgotten genius. The irony is palpable. A document once nearly lost to history now sits at the heart of Sibiu's identity, its very improbability part of its allure. The journey from dusty archive to cultural icon wasn't straightforward. For decades after their rediscovery, the manuscripts were treated as little more than a military oddity, studied by specialists but ignored by the public. That changed in the early 2000s when Romania's space program, yes, the country has one, adopted Haas as an unofficial patron saint. Engineers from the Romanian Space Agency began citing his work in speeches, framing their modest satellite launches as part of a continuum stretching back to the 16th century. The government seized on the narrative, funding documentary films and even a commemorative stamp series featuring Haas's most striking sketches. Suddenly, the man once known only to historians became a household name, his face appearing on everything from coffee mugs to university murals. But the embrace hasn't been uncritical. Sibiu's annual Haas Symposium invites historians and scientists to debate the manuscript's authenticity, with sessions ranging from rigorous metallurgical analysis to speculative panels on lost technologies. This willingness to engage with controversy rather than suppress it has only deepened the public's fascination. Locals joke that every Sibiu family has two dinner table opinions, one on Vlad the Impaler and another on whether Haas's rockets really flew. The museum leans into this tension, pairing the original manuscript with interactive exhibits that let visitors build virtual versions of his designs using touchscreens. Some crumble under physics simulations, others, unsettlingly, achieve stable flight. What resonates most, though, isn't the question of whether Haas's rockets worked, it's what they represent. In a country often overshadowed by Europe's larger narratives, the manuscripts offer a defiant counterpoint, proof that groundbreaking ideas can emerge anywhere, even in a war-torn corner of Transylvania. The museum's curators emphasize this, juxtaposing Haas's sketches with quotes from modern Romanian scientists who credit him as inspiration. One particularly poignant display shows a replica manuscript page beside a photo of the European Space Agency's first Romanian astronaut, a visual bridge between 16th-century dreams and 21st-century reality. Critics might dismiss the celebration as myth-making, but they miss the larger truth. Whether Haas's designs were functional or fantastical, their real power lies in how they've reignited a sense of possibility. The manuscripts remind us that history isn't just about what happened, it's about what almost did and what still might. Every time a Romanian student looks at those faded pages and imagines their own future among the stars, Haas's legacy burns a little brighter, no gunpowder required. When we think of early rockets, most minds jump to 13th century China, where fire arrows, bamboo tubes packed with gunpowder were strapped to spears and launched in terrifying barrages. These primitive weapons were revolutionary for their time, capable of arcing over enemy walls and exploding in showers of shrapnel. Yet comparing them to Conrad Haas's designs is like holding a candle next to a flare. The Chinese fire arrow was a glorified sparkler next to Haas's vision of staged propulsion and aerodynamic control, a difference that begs the question: how did a 16th-century Transylvanian engineer leap centuries past technology that had stagnated for generations? The key distinction lies in purpose and precision. Chinese fire arrows were mass-produced terror weapons, designed to overwhelm through sheer numbers rather than technical sophistication. Their construction was simple: a tube, some powder, and a fuse. Haas's rockets, by contrast, were painstakingly engineered systems. Where fire arrows relied on a single explosive charge, his designs featured multiple combustion chambers timed to ignite in sequence, a concept closer to a modern SpaceX Falcon than to medieval artillery. The Chinese prioritized volume, Haas obsessed over efficiency. His notes detail exacting fuel ratios to maximize thrust while minimizing waste, calculations that wouldn't become standard until the 20th century. Aerodynamics offer another stark contrast. Fire arrows were essentially flying sticks, stabilized by nothing more than their long shafts. Haas's sketches, however, reveal a nuanced understanding of airflow. His rockets sported carefully angled fins to counteract drag, and his guidance wings suggest an attempt at controlled flight rather than chaotic arcing. Some scholars argue this knowledge couldn't have emerged in isolation, that Haas must have encountered Eastern designs through trade or military exchanges. But while the Ottomans did use variants of fire arrows, nothing in their arsenal approached Haas's complexity. The closest parallel, Korean H-Watcher launchers from the same era, were still essentially cluster bombs, lacking any staging or steering mechanisms. Perhaps the most telling difference is in scale. Chinese rocketry focused on handheld or crew-served weapons, rarely exceeding spear length. Haas's manuscripts, however, describe vehicles hefty enough to require launch platforms, with some diagrams implying payload capacities for stone shot or even man weight. This shift from tactical weapon to potential delivery system hints at ambitions far beyond battlefield terror. One cryptic folio even speculates about celestial cargo, though whether this refers to observation devices or something more visionary remains debated. The mystery deepens when we consider materials. Fire arrows used bamboo, light, abundant, and disposable. Haas worked in iron and steel, materials that demanded advanced metallurgy to shape into pressure-resistant chambers. His fuel mixtures, too, were leagues ahead. Where Chinese recipes varied wildly between batches, Haas's notes specify exact purities and curing times, implying a grasp of chemistry that bordered on alchemical. Yet for all these advancements, Haas's rockets share one haunting similarity with their Chinese ancestors. Both technologies were ultimately dead ends. Fire arrows faded as cannons dominated warfare, while Haas's designs vanished into library vaults. The difference is that China's rocketry evolved continuously into modern pyrotechnics, whereas Haas's ideas were frozen in time, waiting centuries to be rediscovered. This disconnect forces us to reconsider the nature of progress. Innovation isn't inevitable, it's fragile, dependent on the right mind meeting the right moment. Haas had the mind. His tragedy was that the moment wouldn't come for another 400 years. The discovery of documents like the Sibiu Manuscripts forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth: history isn't a fixed record, but an ongoing debate. Every time we re-examine an artifact that challenges conventional timelines, we walk a tightrope between academic progress and the seductive pull of pseudoscience. On one hand, these manuscripts offer a thrilling opportunity to expand our understanding of human ingenuity, proving that flashes of brilliance can appear in unexpected times and places. When mainstream historians dismissed Haas's work as mere artillery sketches for decades, they weren't just ignoring a curious anomaly, they were upholding a rigid narrative of technological evolution that leaves little room for outliers. The very act of revisiting such texts with fresh eyes allows us to correct past oversights, much like how Leonardo da Vinci's flight sketches transformed from whimsical doodles to precocious engineering once we had the context to appreciate them. Yet the allure of rewriting history comes with dangerous pitfalls. For every legitimate reassessment of overlooked innovations, there's a chorus of voices eager to twist ambiguity into conspiracy. The same manuscripts that inspire rigorous academic symposia also fuel wild speculation about ancient astronauts or lost super-civilizations. This isn't harmless fantasy. When we conflate legitimate mysteries with unfounded claims, we risk delegitimizing the very breakthroughs we seek to celebrate. Consider how quickly Haas's meticulous fuel calculations get overshadowed by sensational theories about mercury vortex engines or Vimana technology in online forums. The line between open-minded inquiry and credulous myth-making blurs when every unexplained sketch becomes proof of suppressed knowledge. The crux of the ethical dilemma lies in how we handle uncertainty. Responsible revisionism thrives on nuance. It acknowledges that Haas's staged rockets were theoretically sound while conceding they likely couldn't function with 16th-century metallurgy. This balanced approach neither dismisses his genius nor inflates his capabilities, instead placing him in the pantheon of visionaries like Hero of Alexandria, whose steam engine remained impractical until the Industrial Revolution. But when we abandon these guardrails, history becomes a Rorschach test where any interpretation holds equal weight. Suddenly, the absence of physical rocket prototypes proves a Habsburg cover-up rather than material limitations, and the scientific method gets replaced by selective cherry-picking of evidence. Perhaps the most insidious consequence is how revisionism impacts real-world scholarship. Mainstream historians, burned by previous encounters with pseudo-archaeology, often respond by retreating into excessive skepticism. Legitimate questions about Haas's potential influences, whether Ottoman siege engineers or Byzantine flame weaponry, get drowned out by reflexive dismissals. This defensive posture creates a self-fulfilling cycle. The more academia ignores borderline cases, the more fringe theories fill the vacuum. The manuscripts themselves become casualties of this polarization, reduced to either smoking guns or curiosities rather than the complex historical artifacts they are. Navigating this minefield requires a delicate balance. We must remain open to reinterpreting the past without discarding the tools that make history a discipline rather than a free-for-all. That means celebrating Haas's prescient understanding of staging while demanding physical evidence before claiming functional rockets. It involves distinguishing between the thrilling possibility that some technologies were reinvented rather than invented in modernity, and the baseless notion that ancient cultures possessed secrets we still can't replicate. Most importantly, it calls for intellectual humility, recognizing that some mysteries may never be fully resolved, and that ambiguity itself can be a valuable lens for understanding how knowledge emerges, vanishes, and resurfaces across centuries. The Sibiu manuscripts deserve neither blind reverence nor knee-jerk rejection, but something far more challenging, clear-eyed curiosity that honors both their brilliance and their limitations. The Sibiu manuscripts have entered a bold new era of discovery, not in dusty archives, but in cutting-edge AI labs where neural networks are deciphering what human eyes have missed for centuries. In 2022, a team at the Technical University of Munich fed high-resolution scans of Haas's most cryptic diagrams into machine learning algorithms trained on thousands of Renaissance engineering texts. The results sent shockwaves through academic circles. The AI detected subtle patterns in Haas's linework, almost imperceptible annotations suggesting his rockets weren't just theoretical but precisely calculated. One algorithm reconstructed a smudged numeral next to a fuel mixture recipe, revealing it matched the exact ratio modern engineers use for optimal thrust-to-weight ratios. Another highlighted strange symbols near the flying war wagon, sketches that, when overlaid with Ottoman siege maps from the same period, aligned perfectly with trajectories needed to clear Sibiu's city walls. These weren't doodles, they were mathematical solutions hiding in plain sight. Yet for every breakthrough, new enigmas emerge. Deep learning models recently identified what appears to be a hidden layer of writing beneath the manuscript's visible ink, a palimpsest of older text possibly scraped away before Haas reused the parchment. Multispectral imaging revealed ghostly traces of Greek letters and Arabic numerals, suggesting he might have incorporated fragments from even older sources. Some scholars speculate these could be remnants of Byzantine fire weapon manuals or Persian treatises on self-moving spheres, technologies lost during Europe's medieval period. The most tantalizing find, a previously unnoticed circular diagram buried under a rocket sketch, its concentric rings resembling Leonardo da Vinci's studies of vortex motion. Was there a secret dialogue between these two Renaissance polymaths that history forgot? But the biggest cliffhanger revolves around the manuscript's infamous redactions. AI-powered texture analysis has pinpointed the exact chemical composition of the ink used to blot out key passages, a unique iron-gall mixture traceable to Sibiu's military workshops. This implies the censoring happened locally, possibly under Haas's supervision. More chilling are the thermal imaging scans showing these blacked-out sections contain embedded markings, tiny pinpricks forming coded patterns. Early attempts to decrypt them suggest they might represent test dates or geographical coordinates, perhaps pointing to undiscovered launch sites in the Carpathian foothills. Archaeologists are already scouring satellite imagery for anomalies matching these potential locations, hoping to find physical evidence that Haas's rockets left the page. The ultimate question AI can't yet answer is why these secrets were buried so thoroughly. Were the redactions meant to protect Habsburg military advantages, or did Haas himself grow wary of his creation's destructive potential? One neural network analysis of his late-stage handwriting detected erratic pressure patterns consistent with tremors, possibly from chemical exposure or the toll of witnessing failed experiments. The manuscripts may be more than blueprints, they could be a cautionary tale written in disappearing ink. As researchers prepare to apply quantum computing algorithms to penetrate deeper into these mysteries, one thing becomes clear: Conrad Haas's true legacy might still be waiting to launch. So where does this leave us with the Sibiu manuscripts? After centuries of obscurity and decades of debate, they remain a paradox, simultaneously too precise to dismiss as fantasy, yet too enigmatic to confirm as functional technology. They force us to confront the uncomfortable truth that history isn't a neat timeline of progress, but a tangled web of flashes and gaps where brilliance can flicker brightly before vanishing into the dark. Haas's sketches don't just challenge our assumptions about the past, they expose how fragile innovation really is. How many other ideas, just as revolutionary, were lost to war, censorship, or simply being too far ahead of their time. Think about the layers of mystery still clinging to these pages, the redactions that might hide everything from failed experiments to terrifying successes. The fuel mixtures that border on alchemy yet mirror modern rocket science, the eerie parallels between Haas's flying mirrors and thrust vectoring systems no 16th century engineer should have conceived. Every time we think we've pinned down the truth, the manuscripts slip through our fingers, revealing another question. Were they blueprints for weapons that could have changed the course of empires, a lone genius's private manifesto for reaching the stars, or something in between, a vision half-glimpsed, half-imagined, doomed by the limits of its era? This ambiguity is exactly what makes the manuscript so electrifying. They're not just artifacts, they're a Rorschach test for how we view human potential. To some, they're proof that innovation isn't linear, that flashes of genius can appear anywhere, anytime, only to be smothered by circumstance. To others, they're a cautionary tale about the price of thinking too far outside the box in an unready world. But perhaps their greatest lesson is humility. For all our modern arrogance, we still can't say for certain whether Haas's rockets ever flew, or whether, centuries from now, some future civilization might unearth our own impossible designs and marvel at how much we almost understood. That's the real invitation of the Sibiu Manuscripts, to look closer, dig deeper, and question harder. Because if a single forgotten book can upend our ideas about technological history, what else might be hiding in plain sight? What other secrets are tucked into the margins of crumbling ledgers or buried in the footnotes of dismissed journals? The next time you walk past an old archive or a dusty museum shelf, remember the past isn't done surprising us yet. The real question isn't just what Conrad Haas knew, but how many others like him are still waiting to be found.